Bon matin et merci
Good
d'être.
morning, and thank you for being with us today. I'm Tyler McCann, Managing Director at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before starting today's discussion, it's important that I acknowledge that I come to you from Western Quebec, the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe
Canada is a
Nation.
large country with significant amounts of agricultural products, grains, oilseeds, meat, fertilizer, and processed products, often produced far away from customers in Canada and around the world. For a lot of those agri-food products, rail is essential for moving food from producer to processor to consumer, and reliable rail service is essential for success of the sector. We began to convene this dialogue in the lead up to a possible service disruption at CP. Last Monday, we were in day 2 of the work stoppage, which started on the 20th. Just one day later, CP and the Teamsters Union reached an agreement to enter binding arbitration and return to work at noon on March 22nd. This short work stoppage highlighted the impact that labor relations can have on reliability. But it's not just labor. Weather, with extreme flooding in British Columbia and a tough winter, both impacted service over the last 6 months. While it may be tough to use policy tools to manage winter and cold weather, the recent events have highlighted the need to step back and look at the issue through informed, substantive, and balanced dialogue. CAPI has convened a panel of experts today with the objective of exploring the impact of service disruptions, the current state of rail reliability, recourse mechanisms, and policy options. A quick note that, as with all of CAPI's webinars, today's dialogue will be recorded and shared with registered participants shortly after the event. We invite you to join CAPI's YouTube channel, where you will be notified as soon as the recording is live on YouTube and all future CAPI videos are available. On the YouTube channel, you can find a recording of the recent virtual panel discussion we hosted on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its impact on farmers in the region and in Canada and the food system they both feed into. Later this week, CAPI will release a follow-up report that explores this issue further. I'd like to begin today's webinar by introducing each panelist individually and asking them a question based on their experience and expertise. Then we will move to questions for the group and questions from the audience. The first question I will ask the group will be about whether rail should be made an essential service. We encourage you to write in your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. This morning, I'd like to start by introducing Karen Proud. Karen has been the president and CEO of Fertilizer Canada since April 2021. She previously worked for more than 2 decades in senior management roles in both the public and private sectors. After almost a decade in Health Canada, in 2006, Karen left the public service to pursue opportunities in the private sector, including her most recent role before Fertilizer Canada as Chief Operating Officer for Food, Health and Consumer Products of Canada. Karen, before we get into the issues around rail reliability, I wanted to ask you to take a minute and update us on the state of fertilizer supplies in Canada. We know that this has been a topic that's been in the news. It's been impacted by the invasion of Ukraine, supply chain disruptions. How are things looking across the country as we head into planting season this year?
Thanks, Tyler. It's really a pleasure to be here today. There was a lot of concern recently with the CP strike about the fertilizer supplies. That came on top of, as you said, the war in Ukraine. A lot of people don't know that our eastern provinces are highly, highly dependent on nitrogen fertilizers coming from Russia during this time of year in order to be ready for seeding season. So when the war started and the sanctions came into place, we were already scrambling to get supply into this country in order to make sure farmers had what they need when the time came. Then we ended up with this CP strike or lockout, whatever they ended up calling it in the end. And that was also of extreme concern. Normally, by the end of March, we have all of our inventories in place so that farmers have access to the fertilizer they need at the time they need it. Fertilizer is a pretty unique product, Tyler, in that we can't use it sort of effectively any time of the year. We've got that window of opportunity where when farmers are seeding, they need the fertilizer in place in order to make the most of their yields. And while they do use fertilizer throughout the year and at different times, seeding season is the most important time. So leading up to the end of the month where we usually have full supply, we were already maybe 2 to 3 weeks behind in our supply because of weather and other disruptions in the supply chain. With the CP strike, we were really concerned about the effect of that. And I think what people don't really understand is for every hour of disruption, we get delays for potentially days. And 2 days of a strike, it may not sound very significant, but it can be weeks of delay. And if you ask any farmer who's ready to plant, weeks of delay is a huge delay, and it will affect the yields at the end of the day. We were also about 2 hours away from shutting down a potash mine when we heard that the strike had ended. So again, that would have been significant, not just for Canada, but for the rest of the world that depends on the supply of Canadian fertilizer. And when we have to shut down, we don't get those inventories back. So that again would have been very concerning. So at this stage, we are behind schedule with having our full inventories. We hope to be able to have those. We also hope to have enough stock for our eastern provinces and for the farmers there. We're working really hard on that, but these sorts of things at this time of year are really the worst possible disruptions that we could have to the supply chain.
And I think something that again I didn't fully appreciate is how dependent the fertilizer sector is on rail and how timely that is. Can you maybe speak a little bit further to how sensitive the fertilizer supply chain is to disruptions? Again, you spoke about hours away from having to shut down a potash mine.
Yeah, so we ship 75% of fertilizers in Canada get shipped by rail. And so that is hugely significant to us. And not only is that shipped for our domestic supply, we ship down to the US, who are highly, highly dependent on Canadian fertilizer. And then we ship out to the coast in order to service our international customers. When it comes to our manufacturing and specifically our mining facilities, we don't have a huge capacity to store the product that we make. We make it to ship it out. And that's the agreement we have with the rail companies. We make it, you ship it. If we are delayed and backed up, we have to shut down production because we've got nowhere to keep these supplies. And so you can see the fragility of the system where even after a couple of days, we're getting to a point where we're going to have to shut down. And I had mentioned sort of the growing season in Canada, but our US customers, of course, start their growing season even earlier. And so the fragility of this system, it's really about just in time in some cases where we're manufacturing our product and we're shipping it to customers across Canada, to the US and internationally. And when you factor in the war in the Ukraine, where Russia is the #2 export of potash. Canada's #1. We should be very proud of that. Russia's #2. There's now a huge gap in supply. And so our international customers are counting on us even more to make sure that those supply chains are working. And when they're not, it certainly doesn't reflect well on Canada and Canada's reputation with our international partners.
And so Fertilizer Canada, in the lead up to the strike, had called for the federal government to develop long-term approaches and a regulatory environment that ensures Canada is a reliable trading partner. Can you build on that? What are you looking for? What do you want that regulatory environment to include?
Well, Tyler, I think we're open to a lot of discussion on this. I know we're going to talk about rail as an essential service, and ultimately, I think at Fertilizer Canada, we see that as a viable option on the table. But certainly, we need to make sure that we don't end up with these disruptions. It seems every year in some case, and we know that there's even another upcoming negotiation this year with CN that could potentially lead to a similar outcome. And so whatever the government does, it needs to make sure that these essential products like fertilizer, like other agricultural products, where there's especially a time constraint on them, it needs to be, we need to have a solution so that we don't end up with these disruptions. We need to invest more in our infrastructure. And I know we're going to talk in a few minutes about rail as an essential service, and we certainly support that.
Great, thank you. So now I'd like to head to our next panelist. Wade Sobkowich has been with the Western Grain Elevators Association for 25 years and executive director of the association since 2004. Prior to this, Wade worked as an economic development officer for the communities of Morris and Gimli, Manitoba. Wade grew up on a cattle farm in Fisher Branch, Manitoba, and now lives in Winnipeg with his wife and 3 children. Wade, grain shippers and farmers have been raising concerns with the reliability of rail service for years. Over a decade ago, it got to the point where the federal government instituted quotas for grain movement in response to a significant challenge at the time. You know, since then, there's been a Canadian Transportation Act review and legislative changes that have been put in place. How do you see the state of rail reliability today for grain shippers compared to what it was then? And how is service improved or changed, and how is that dynamic involved?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tyler. Thanks for having me on. So I guess it's important to start a number of years ago talking about service reliability that we were seeing prior to the passage of Bill C-49, which was legislation intended to provide some balance and accountability between railway companies and shippers. So we were getting poor service up until about 2017, 2018. And then Bill C-49 passed. And then we had 2 years of pretty good service overall. It wasn't perfect, but it was acceptable, I would say, rail service levels in 2019 and 2020. And then you know, some observers of the industry were I guess thinking out loud or wondering out loud whether we turned a corner on our rail service woes of the past, and now maybe we're entering a new era of you know, a more balance and better service and the railway's ability to move the commodities. But we're also cautious about that thought because we knew the last 2 years we were in COVID, and there wasn't as much being shipped on other from other sectors, certain other sectors. Grain was still moving. Grain was essential, and rail was essential, deemed essential by the federal government. So we you know, we were wondering what would happen when other sectors picked up again, and perhaps if we had a cold winter, what would happen? And this year it all sort of did happen. We had a drought this summer, as many of your listeners would know. And we, at the time, in the middle of the summer, we were getting many concerns from our customers from overseas and domestically, wondering if there was going to be enough product for them and if they needed to source it elsewhere. And we were assuring them at the time, you know, if our track record over the last 2 years is any indication, yes, we have a smaller crop, but the good news is we should be able to get it to you in a timely way. Well, it didn't play out that way because we had, of course, the fires in BC and then the flooding in BC. And then we had a colder than normal winter and higher snowfalls, and then Omicron variant ran through the workforces of the railway. So we didn't get the service that we had expected to get. And even though we were having we had a crop size that was 2/3 of a normal crop size, we weren't able to move it in a timely way. And some of that we can control, and some of it we can't. And you know, when it came to the flooding, you know, we acknowledge that there's not much that can be done about that. In fact, we're impressed with the railway's ability to react to that as quickly as they did and get the lines up and running. And then come January, we were expecting to start shipping again in a real fulsome way. But that didn't happen. We were getting really poor service in January and February, and so that's sort of what happened this year from a grain perspective, and it really demonstrated to us that there are a number of obstacles in the way here, and some of them are controllable and some of them aren't controllable. And but they are based in some fundamental issues, I guess, immutable facts that where the competitive environment and the legislative environment allow certain things to happen from a system point of view. And we just think from an economic perspective, there are so many things that we could do as a country to control the things we can control in order to have our supply chains functioning properly. And I think during COVID, if it wasn't clear to the population and to the government that supply chains are important before COVID, it should be now, and that they need to be preserved at all costs in order for the economy to continue to function properly, in order for our customers to continue to get product. Frankly, right now our reputation is very, very bad with our customers, and so we have some ideas on what solutions we might be proposing or advocating for, but that's the state of affairs for grain right now.
Great. Thank you, Wade, and we'll dive into those solutions in a minute. I'd like to now turn to our next panelist, Dr. Malcolm Cairns. Dr. Malcolm Cairns joined the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1994 as Director of Business Research and spent nearly 2 decades involved in the analysis of a range of longer-term strategic issues. Prior to this, Malcolm worked for nearly 20 years with the federal government in various positions and departments, including the Canadian Transportation Commission, the Grain Transportation Agency, and Transport Canada. Malcolm retired in 2011 and continues to consult and publish work on current rail and infrastructure issues. Malcolm, railways face competing pressures. We've heard from Fertilizer and Grain about the pressure that they have to deliver products to markets, but railways also have to deliver oil and other products. They're also under pressures from investors that are urging them to improve operating efficiency and cut costs. I was wondering if you could start by speaking to how you see railways managing these pressures and what that means for the reliability of rail service for agriculture, food, and input suppliers.
First of all, thanks to the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute for the invitation to be a panelist. As you noted, I am retired, so the basis of my remarks today in response to your questions is a longer-term view of the performance of CP and CN, together with an examination of their grain plans for 2021-22, which they presented to the federal government last summer. Over several decades, the railways have satisfied the total demands of shippers and matched the growth of Canadian GDP. They've achieved significant productivity gains of some 2% year after year, and have shared that improvement with a steady decline in real freight rates and a steady reductions in accidents. This has been achieved in part by a very significant capital expenditure of some 20% each year of revenues. And railways, of course, are one of the most capital intensive industries. And this has also been accompanied by improving returns to investors. Now, focusing more closely on their recent grain plans, I note the following points. On freight cars, each of CP and CN has publicly committed to acquire some 6,000 new high-capacity grain hopper cars, and to date, they are roughly halfway through their acquisitions. These cars are shorter, wider, can carry more grain than the hoppers being retired, and can be loaded and unloaded more efficiently, and are more reliably, thereby reducing maintenance delays. On locomotives, both railways have recently modernized their locomotive fleets with high horsepower and fuel-efficient locomotives. CP has acquired 386 of these, and CN is adding another 75 to their complement of 260 that's already been acquired. On track infrastructure, CP is currently extending sidings and installing centralized traffic control on 8 subdivisions in the west to increase line capacity. And while CN is investing 250 million on double track sidings and yard track expansion projects. Particularly on technology, CP is investing significantly here to reduce terminal dwell time, increase reliability of shipments, and decrease service interruptions and reduce cycle times. This involves above rail technologies. This is wheel life forecasting, cracked wheel detection, wheel impact load detectors, predictive bearing failure sensors, and train airflow monitoring. Also below wheel technologies such as broken rail detection on non-signal tracks and enhanced rail floor detection. Similarly, CN is investing in the acquisition and implementation of cutting-edge technology, including technology to detect, mitigate, and prevent disruptions from washouts, rockfalls, and landslides. On operations, in recent years on the operational front, both railways operate longer and heavier trains with distributive power to improve capacity and productivity. CP has implemented a dedicated train program which gives shippers the ability to lock in capacity for a 12-month period. It commits CP to provide the capacity, shippers to commit to use the capacity, and reciprocal penalties. CP has also implemented a high efficiency train model, which provides economic incentives for high throughput elevators to load 8,500-foot trains in 12 hours or less. CN has also improved operations in Vancouver and Prince Rupert with capacity enhancements that enable greater throughput, and is increasing the number of air distribution cars that it has to 101 for more reliable train operations during cold weather. On relationships, both railways indicate their commitment to improved collaboration and communication with stakeholders in the whole of the grain handling system. On final matters, I think that you're particularly interested in, I will say the following. Perhaps much of the general concern of shippers relates to service disruptions and delays, which arise from events such as cold weather or flooding, which has already been mentioned. Such events are obviously beyond the control of the railways and are an annual risk. But it's too early to say whether climate change will make them more frequent in the short run. It has been suggested that the railways should provide excess capacity above and beyond what's required to serve expected peaks in order to address such events. However, this raises two immediate questions. Who is willing to pay higher freight rates in order to provide such excess capacity? And to what extent would such excess capacity also be affected by the events themselves? Secondly, I've heard of complaints that the railways are favouring the movement of containers to ports rather than grain. This is not surprising since container shippers are willing to pay for premium service, while grain is limited by the maximum revenue cap. Perhaps it's time that that's be eliminated. There's also been talk of designating freight rail as an essential service, and that's already been brought up, presumably to prevent strikes and lockouts. Evidence presented by CP recently suggests that the frequency of such events is quite rare. And when they do occur, the federal government is usually quick to step in with back to work legislation. And at the very recent event, of course, the actual stoppage was only a matter of hours. It's likely that a designation of essential would impair labor relations and be a step backwards. And lastly, legislated attempts to getting more products moving on rail are generally costly and ineffective. Thank you, and I'll endeavour to address any further questions you may have.
Thank you, Malcolm. I'm sure there's lots there that we'll pick up on after. We'll come back to that. But first, I'd like to go to our final panelist, Dr. Scott Streiner. Scott is a mediator and arbitrator with ADR Chambers, a senior advisor with Deloitte, and an adjunct professor with Carleton University. Prior to this, Scott spent over 30 years with the Government of Canada in various leadership roles dealing with issues of transportation, trade, infrastructure, and dispute resolutions. His last public sector role was Chair and CEO of the Canadian Transportation Agency. Thank you, Scott, for being with us this morning. I'd like to start with probably a simple question. We're like to talk a lot about evidence and fact here. From how do you see when you look at the role that you've done, how do you measure rail reliability?
Well, first of all, Thanks, Tyler and to CAPI for having me today. It's a great question, and it's a question to which there's not a really an easy answer, Tyler. You know, over the years, there have been different attempts to assess the overall reliability of the system, but that runs into really two challenges. One of them is the availability of data. Do we have enough data in order to look at the overall system fluidity? The answer is no. And the other is how individual service requirements can be. So it's as to some degree, some of my fellow panelists have suggested, it's entirely possible that a sector or a group of shippers or a shipper in one region or with one product are experiencing good service during a period where others feel that their service is inadequate. Now, the traditional way that shippers have wanted to measure reliability has, of course, been order fulfillment. And order fulfillment can be one way of looking at reliability. And back when I was at the CTA and before that at Transport Canada, it was a measure that was considered. But it will be, familiar to some of my fellow panelists and to many of the folks who have turned in, the conversation about this between railway companies and shippers may ring a few bells. Oftentimes, railway companies argue that order fulfillment is not a good measure because shippers will order more cars than in fact they need. Shippers in turn will say that that's largely a myth, but to the extent that they sometimes order an addition of cars beyond what they might need, that's because of the service that they typically get from railway companies. Then we get into this kind of vicious cycle. So order fulfillment, it may be one source of information, but it's almost certainly not sufficient. So I think the bottom line is that to a degree, we can't measure overall system reliability or fluidity with the data and the tools that we currently have available. What we can do is using a variety of measures, including order fulfillment. We can look at the experience of individual shippers, individual regions, individual sectors. And as we start to zero in that way, we can get a better sense of what the reliability is or what the service levels are. If we wanted to go to something that was more system-wide, that would really require the collection of far more data, that are kind of clearly objective, and the ability to process those data to look at flows across the system and identify things like bottlenecks. And again, as I say, some initial efforts have been made in that direction, but more would be required in order to be able to really get that kind of a systemic view.
Great, thank you. And Scott, you started off your career to have gone back and spent most of it working around the mediation and arbitration. It's a tool certainly in the labor context that we've just seen. Again, it was binding arbitration that ended the work stoppage, but it's also a tool that shippers and railways use to negotiate contracts. I was wondering if you could spend a minute talking about how you see mediation and arbitration, what role it plays in improving rail reliability and service in Canada.
Okay, thanks, Tyler. Maybe I'll come at that from both angles, sort of the labor side and then the contractual or the commercial relationships between shippers and railway companies. So let's start on the labor side. I know that you're going to kind of bring us back to the question around rail as an essential service, which two of our panelists have already suggested would be a step that they would support. The relationship between railway companies and the unions that represent some of their employees is governed by the Canada Labour Code. And under the Canada Labour Code, before there can be any sort of a work stoppage, there has to be a process of mediation and of conciliation that the parties have to go through. And, those processes, in the majority of cases result in settlements. They result in collective agreements, such that it's a minority of disputes, of labor disputes that actually end up in a work stoppage, either a strike or a lockout situation. When they do, the parties can, as they did in the CP, in the recent CP Teamsters case, can opt for a process of binding arbitration or a med-arb process, a mediation arbitration process, which is kind of a variant on that. So the tools of mediation and arbitration are, critical and are deployed in order to resolve labor disputes in the system. Both before and after any kind of a work stoppage. So that's on the labor side, very familiar from that context. On the commercial side, the relationship between shippers and railway companies, there are really kind of two paths through which mediation and arbitration can be used. One is the statutory path, which is administered by the Canadian Transportation Agency, which, as you know, that I used to lead. There are mediation services available through the CTA, and there are options to have arbitrated service level agreements or arbitration of rates administered by the Canadian Transportation Agency. So there's statutory mediation and arbitration available, but the mediation requires both parties to agree, and the arbitration requires that a shipper pull the trigger, and the shipper has to demonstrate first that they've tried to negotiate a commercial agreement directly with the railway company before they can have access to those mechanisms. The second path is private mediation and arbitration, the sort of work that I'm doing now. And that would be when a shipper and a railway company decide that they're going to turn to a commercial mediator arbitrator to assist them either in reaching a contract or in interpreting and applying a contract. Mediation and arbitration services are widely used in the commercial context. They've actually been used less in this context historically, in the shipper railway company context in Canada, but they are typically, across any sector, a cheaper, faster, and less litigious option than kind of going through statutory litigation. So relying more on commercial mediation and arbitration services may be one way that shippers and railway companies can start to more effectively bridge some of the gaps between them.
Great, thank you, Scott. And so I'd like to now, with our first question to the four panelists, get to, I think, what is may by some be the headline when it comes to rail strikes, and that's around rail as an essential service. Certainly, when you look at the stories leading up to the recent work stoppage, we heard many in the agri-food sector calling for rail to be made an essential service. I think that's something we hear over and over again, and so we'd like to start there. I'm going to go through the panel and give everyone an opportunity to speak to this, and then open it up. And again, if any of our participants have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them after. But Karen, you touched on this earlier. I think the simple question is, should rail service be made an essential service?
If it's that black and white, I would say yes. I do think we need to find a way to ensure we don't have a work stoppage like we've experienced in the past. And if that means rail has to be deemed an essential service, then I think if that's the only option, I think that deserves serious consideration. I mean, when you are talking about the sorts of products and commodities we're talking about, I mean, this is food for people. I don't know what is more essential than that to make sure that we are able to meet the needs of Canadians and those around the globe. So my question to that, Tyler, or my answer to that, Tyler, would be yes, or short of that, some mechanism that would prevent these sorts of stoppages.
Great. And so Wade, then to you, should rail be made an essential service?
The idea of collective bargaining resulting in a work stoppage, a strike, or a lockout, I think under normal circumstances, it makes sense. The idea is that it puts so much, you've tried everything else, it puts so much pain on the parties that they're motivated to come together quickly and resolve the disagreement. And the pain that the employees experience is loss of wage, and the pain that the company experience is loss of business. In the case of the rail freight environment, it's not like that. Especially for grain, I would say, and I don't want to speak for Karen, but fertilizer, is that the rail, because we're beholden to dual monopolies here with CN and CP, and I'm not blaming the railways, okay? I'm just stating that that's what it is. When you're an elevator planted in the middle of Saskatchewan and you have a CP line running past you, you're not beholden to a duopoly. You're beholden to a monopoly. And so we would love to have a duopoly situation, but we don't have that. So under that circumstance, there are no competitive alternatives. If a grocery store goes on strike, you can go to the other grocery store and shop as a customer. As a customer of a railway, your product sits and waits. and you have to shut down production potentially, or you have to tell your customers that they're not going to get the product that they ordered. You have to enact event of delay. Normally, it's less sophisticated countries that have to enact event of delay, which is a clause in their contracts that helps them mitigate damages on sale. So with that being said, the motivation of that pain that I talked about isn't there in both cases. And it's really shippers and their customers and grain producers that feel the pain. But we're not at the bargaining table. So we view this as a different set of circumstances that shouldn't apply to where a work stoppage shouldn't be eligible. And there are other models, like there are other essential services like the police force and doctors, and where they have alternative mechanisms to resolve disputes. I don't think anybody, and we're certainly not saying that there shouldn't be a fair and reasonable outcome. It's just that it should be reached by some other mechanism, in this case binding arbitration, which is what we were suggesting they both agree to for weeks leading up to the stoppage, and then they ended up there anyway. But we had to turn, when we know a work stoppage is coming, we have to start shutting down the system. We have to start telling our customers they're not going to get product. We have to start, again, adding to the damage to our reputation. We have to start shutting down producer deliveries into the system. So even though the stoppage only lasted for 2 days, really it had a week of an impact for us. And it all could have been avoided if the parties were just required to go to binding arbitration to begin with. And presumably, if they feel that their positions are reasonable, both management and the workforce, then they would allow their position to withstand the rigor of an arbitrator. So we really think that rail service needs to be made an essential service, as was established during COVID-19, that it is essential. Let's make it essential, and let's find another fair mechanism so we don't have to deal with work stoppages every year or two.
Great, thanks, Wade. Now, Malcolm, you spent decades looking at these strategic issues that railways face. I would imagine labor's probably got to be very near the top of the list of strategic issues a railway has to deal with on an ongoing basis. Do you think making rail service an essential service is the solution?
Well, as I said earlier, I don't believe it is. And you might be surprised to know that actually labor matters did not really reign very large in my role as working for CP. And that's because, as I indicated in my remarks, they really are very infrequent. And even when they get to the point, as it did this time, and if there had been the necessity, the government usually always steps in. What we're really doing is focusing on a relatively minor issue that happened to be occurring at the moment. And it's not usual. And I would also emphasize that the notion that it's essential, it wouldn't start getting essential that you move even if there's a flood or even if there's a disruption of the cold weather and so on. I mean, there's a limit to what can be done. And I think, as I indicated in my remarks, the railways have been making extraordinary efforts to try and improve the situation year after year. And it would be disruptive to try and break the long pattern of events that Scott indicated, which exist at the present moment in the legislative mediation and arbitration rules, and then the fact that there exist private versions. And the notion of making it somehow new and different sounds to me like a lot of effort for very little gain.
And so, Scott, I'm curious as to your views on this, and maybe rather than asking you the question, should rail service be made an essential, maybe I could ask you the question, will rail service be made an essential service?
So interesting way to pose it, Tyler, because I would in fact like to speak not to, the question of the should question, what's our policy preference, but rather perhaps inject a little bit of realism to the conversation around kind of what the history is. So I think my simple answer to your question is I would rate the odds of there being legislative action or other action to deem rail an essential service very, very low. Notwithstanding the important points that both Karen and Wade have made around the impact of labor disruptions in the rail sector on shippers, I think it's very unlikely that would ever happen. And here there's a number of reasons. First of all, the Canada Labour Code does not include any provisions at the moment to allow for any particular sector to kind of have a sweeping essential service designation. That's in contrast to provincial labor legislation, which does, hence police and firefighters, et cetera. So this would require, in fact, a fundamental re-engineering of the Canada Labor Code. So that's the first data point. Second point I would make is that the Supreme Court of Canada, in a series of decisions from 2007 until 2015, has found that the right to collective bargaining, including the right to strike, is protected by the Charter, by Section 2 of the Charter. So it's now a constitutionally protected right. And of course, the Supreme Court will only accept any derogation from constitutional rights if there's a compelling reason for it and there's minimal impairment to those rights. So it would be a very high bar to pass. And previous Supreme Court decisions, the series that have come out between 2007 and 15, have effectively all struck down provincial laws that remove the right to strike. So you've got legislation that would need to be re-engineered. You've got a high charter risk. And then I would also note that back when I was Assistant Deputy Minister of Labor and head of the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, there was an attempt, which I think was kind of semi-public. Some folks on this line would know about this, to have dock workers deemed an essential service. Similar arguments, right? The movement of goods. And it was a pretty hard push at the time, and it didn't bear fruit. And without getting too much into politics, that was at the time that there was a Conservative government. And we now have a Liberal government that's in a supply and confidence arrangement with the NDP. So for all of those reasons, I think the likelihood of legislative action to deem rail an essential service and to ban strikes and lockouts is low. Malcolm is right. Very rarely do these work stoppages go on for very long. The Parliament of Canada almost always intervenes, the government and then the Parliament, with back to work legislation within a few days if a deal is not reached. The threat of back to work legislation normally drives or often drives some kind of an agreement like the one we saw between CP and the Teamsters. I don't, in saying that, negate the points that Karen and Wade have made on how disruptive the mere threat of a labor stoppage can be. But the reality is there's a long historical record that labor stoppages tend to be very short because there does tend to be intervention. So those are my observations on, objectively speaking, what are the odds of something like this happening?
Anybody want to pick up on any points that have been made? Wade, go ahead.
Sure. I guess one thing that there is in the Canada Labour Code is Clause 87.7, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Scott, and that's where the longshore industry is not able to strike against loading vessels for grain. And so that was done because it was determined that grain is an important food product, and it's produced by farmers, and their livelihoods depend on it. And so whenever the longshore industry goes on strike or a longshore union goes on strike, they're obligated to continue to load vessels for grain. And so that does us no good if we can't get the grain there. So it doesn't necessarily do what it was intended to do unless the rail piece is also made essential. And I know that the idea is it doesn't happen very often, but we look back at a timeline, and if you take a look at either CN and CP, it may be for each, if you look at it at railways on an individual basis, but if you look at both of them, and sectors, fertilizer and grain have networks that exist on both CN and CP. It's every year and a half, where we either have a work stoppage or the threat of a work stoppage. So to us, that's pretty frequent. And whether it ends up happening or not, we end up doing damage to our reputation. So, I take Malcolm's point that there, as essential, there's cold weather, there's flooding. How do you make it essential when there are certain things that is as essential as you want to make it? You can't control those things. And I do understand that point. But as a country, with more and more disruptions we're seeing that are uncontrollable, we should take the opportunity to control what we can control. And in our view, this is one of them.
Hey, Karen?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. And I think, being a realist, I think it's probably unlikely that the government is going to move anytime soon. But we have seen the federal government bring forward legislation in the past that people thought would never happen, that does affect what people thought were constitutional rights, and there's been rationale for it. I think more and more Canadians are concerned about food security. You never used to hear that term even used years ago. We just assumed we would have all the food on the shelves we needed. I think COVID has changed people's thinking a lot. I think this war in Ukraine is going to have a long-term effect on where Canada sees itself in the rest of the world and the role of Canada in the rest of the world when it comes to especially agriculture and helping to feed the world. And so those things, as consumers become more savvy and more concerned about food security, not only in this country, but looking globally, those are things I think that can sway our politicians into looking at strategically what are those sectors that are so important that we do need to have some fairly unique protections around them, and where is Canada's real place in the world. And I know just from our industry, Canada has a big place in the world, and there are countries that are counting on us. And so again, today, the likelihood that anyone's going to bring forward a bill anytime soon to change our labor code, probably not likely. But as we see more and more discussion around this, and as there are more disruptions, and as food security becomes more top of mind, and as we're concerned about feeding the world and Canada's responsibility, I'd like to be a bit optimistic that the conversations are going to start happening, and people are going to look at this in with more interest and in earnest to see what we can do to make sure we've got a more robust and not such a fragile supply chain in Canada.
So I'd like to, Scott, before I go to you, I'd like to bring in a question from the audience, and maybe I'll go to Malcolm first and then to you, Scott, because it builds on something you said earlier. But the question's around data, because I think if we get to that point that Karen's just talking about, where we're having a bigger dialogue about this, the role of data and evidence is going to be important. You know, the question speaks to the fact that now it may appear like we're arguing over anecdote, but others are talking about how do we better have data to make the case and guide government action. You know, Malcolm, you've written about, again, innovation in the rail space. You know, how much data do we have today? Do we need more data on these issues to guide better decision making and understand what actually is impacting reliability?
Well, the simple fact is that the railways do have the data that people might be thinking about. Obviously, their job, in fact, one of their fundamental jobs is to try to find out where the bottlenecks are, what sort of performance has been less than it should have been, and in what ways can they actually invest in new technologies that will make that a little easier to bear. And I was explaining in my remarks about the extent to which that happens. Both railways, in fact, both CN and CP do the same thing. I'm not sure to what extent they might consider some of the data confidential. And I'm not sure to what extent governments think they could do a better job of putting it together and making a better decision than CP and CN already do. And I'm not convinced at all that governments would necessarily make the right decisions for the companies based on having all that knowledge that we, in fact, it's embedded within them. They do have. So I would question, that's really where I would go. I mean, it's not that there isn't the data there, well, it's not always completely there, but it more or less is there. And the government, the countries, the railway companies are making their financial decisions based on that information and trying to sort of move more and more product in a more timely fashion.
Scott, I'm sure you have views around how government uses data to make decisions. Your
Indeed.
thoughts?
Indeed. When I was in government, we always wanted more data. And of course, you know, Malcolm's right. The data are available. Railway companies know what they move. Shippers know what they order. They know what they've got. They know what moves. They know when it goes, right? So it's not that the data don't exist somewhere. It's that there's no obligation to submit them all to one authority that will then put them together and get a picture of the system. And I actually think the reason is pretty simple, and this is not limited to railway companies and shippers. Very few private businesses like to turn over reams of data on their performance and on their activities to government because they don't know how it's going to be used. And in the case of railway companies and shippers, you know, it will come as no shock to anyone that, you know, there would be a concern either that you'd have a competitive disadvantage because your colleagues' competitors would see what you're up to, or the complaints might be brought against you and on the basis of the data. So if there were a desire to construct, let's call it a great big map on a wall with the whole system, and we, could see everything that's moving and where there are problems, et cetera, it could be done with data that are out there, waybill data, order fulfillment data, terminal data from ports, but it would require, either because people volunteer it or because they're compelled, the submission of a lot of data that parties across the system view as being confidential to some central source to process, and presumably some parameters around how those data get used once you've got a picture of system fluidity.
Wade or Karen, again, fertilizer companies, grain companies have data. Your thoughts on them supplying it? Wade first.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we do something like this. So we take the data that we have that we get from the railways, and we take the data that we purchase data through RailLink, and we get shipper demand data for the grain sector, and we publish something weekly. It's called the Ag Transport Coalition. So you can find it, and we put percentages to it. It demonstrates how the railways are performing week in and week out, how many rail cars they're supplying for a given week against how many rail cars that were ordered for that given week. To us, that's the fundamental measurement. It's supply and demand. What are you getting for rail car supply versus what's your demand for that week, and that really paints, most of the picture from our perspective.
And Tyler, I think the data that's really missing and where we need to focus, if we even want to go down a conversation about rail as essential or not, is the data on the impact of these shutdowns and disruptions. And I think if each of the sectors that are affected pulled together that data, it would build a pretty compelling story about what happens in a 2-3 week long shutdown on not only on the industries themselves. And I can tell you, back the last time we had to shut down a facility due to a rail strike, my industry alone lost $200 to $300 million just in that 8-day period of time. And that's just one sector. That doesn't mean what happened to the farmers. That doesn't talk about the impact on price of food. If we had, I think, a missing area for data, it's really on that impact of what does this cause? Because I think that would shed a lot of light for policymakers and politicians on whether this is an issue worth tackling.
And so I want to go in the couple of minutes we have left to a question that I think is an interesting one. So if essential service isn't a practical option, if weather is what weather is going to be and may be impacting it further, do we need to think about a more bold solution? Is there something else that's out there that can help address this, that can solve the reliability or the capacity challenges that exist today? And anybody have bold policy solutions they'd like to put on the table this morning? Wade?
Sure, why not? So I think that one of the things that would help is to create that environment that I talked about earlier. Like if you have a situation with a railway, because of the monopoly that they enjoy, that they're not necessarily as motivated, I would say, to reach an agreement as quickly as if they were in a competitive environment. So how do you create that competitive environment? How do you get there? How do you allow interswitching? Do you allow joint line running rights? Do you allow the competing carrier to come in and move that product when a railway is facing a work stoppage situation? I think that would be probably a good way to go. Another thing we could do is hold the railways accountable to the grain plans that they produce. Like we have grain plans that are produced, but they don't meet those numbers. And this year in particular, they're providing well under half of those numbers. So if they were accountable to meeting those grain numbers, in spite of a work stoppage, then maybe there would be, a greater. You would create more of an environment that is reminiscent of a competitive environment, and then perhaps a work stoppage would work okay because shippers would have alternatives.
Thank you, Scott.
So 3 thoughts on this. First of all, Of course, increased competitive tension in the system, has advantages, right? We know that competition spurs service improvements just generally across the economy, reduces rates, et cetera. Short of, I think I peeked at the question, short of building a new railway line in the country, which is extremely expensive and runs into all kinds of right-of-way issues, short of that, there are tools in the legislation now to help to increase competitive tension. And certainly during my period at the CTA, there were no long-haul interswitching applications brought forward, but long-haul interswitching was introduced as part of Bill C-49. It's an example as a mechanism to try to increase competitive tension within the system. I know, that shippers' representatives like Cairns and Wade feel that there are some flaws in what Parliament ultimately passed, but I would just observe that even the current legislative environment does include some mechanisms aimed at, increasing competition within the system. So that's one. The second thing I would say, I'm going to pick up on something I talked about earlier, but the work around the longshoremen back in the late aughts, ultimately the result of that was long-term collective agreements. So no, there was no legislation passed to make the work on the docks essential, other than Wade, as you know, the longstanding carve out for grain. But the pressure did result in 8-year collective agreements between the British Columbia Maritime Employers Association and the Longshoremen Union, which created the kind of certainty that shippers look for. So while shippers aren't at the table, they might want, short of getting the essential services designation, that they'd like to think about how do they encourage longer-term collective agreements between railway companies and their unions, because that also introduces some stability. And the last thing that I'll say is, and it goes back to an answer that I gave previously, but, I would encourage, where we have shipper representatives on the line, grain companies, others, if they're not currently looking at mechanisms for dispute resolution directly with railway companies, mediation, arbitration type mechanisms, I'd encourage them to do so, because at the end of the day, shippers and railway companies have been having versions of this argument, I think, pretty much since the first tracks were laid. And it's important to try to manage those relationships and, as much as possible, have ways of resolving frictions that don't resolve in escalation.
Thank you. Malcolm, your thoughts on whether or not we need to lay more tracks, or are there other bold solutions that exist?
No, I don't believe there are. I would simply perhaps just emphasize something which I didn't mention, but it essentially is true. And I know that there's been a reference earlier on to international circumstances. Canada has probably the two best world-class railways in the world. Like it or not, the freight railways I'm referring to. The Americans have 4, of course, the 2 in the West and the 2 in the East. They do not perform, if you measure them, quite as well as we do. And there's no other country, the Europeans, the Asians, they do not move the sorts of product volumes that we have to move under conditions like our cold weather and so forth that we have to survive. Really, they are world-class, and they are top of the, and the notion that we can somehow resolve all these petty, what I would call overall, relatively minor issues that occur sometimes is a bit fanciful. I mean, they will happen. People, the cold weather does inhibit the railways. There's flooding, and there's occasional threat of strikes. Generally speaking, they don't occur. And I mean, I can't foresee any way in which governments could somehow make it any better. More likely, they would make it worse if they intervened.
Right. And Karen, over to you. Bold policy solutions we should be thinking about on this issue?
Gosh, I wish, Tyler, I had some bold policy thoughts on this. I don't think I can build much more on what Wade and Scott have suggested, but only other than to add, I think we need to have those policy conversations to see what the options are, and because I recognize from Malcolm, these may be sort of sporadic annual type events. Their impacts can be massive. And I think we need to find a better solution, because, as I said, even just this year, there's another one coming up, and can have huge detrimental effects, not only in Canada, but internationally. And if Canada is really going to be seen as a country that can be relied on, we need to have a supply chain that others see as stable and working. So I would certainly welcome the conversation to ferret out those big, bold policy ideas.
Right. Well, that's a good note to end on. We like big, bold policy ideas here, and we like conversations as to how to arrive at them. Again, thank you very much to our 4 panelists for being here today. These are important issues, and these are important things that we talk about not just in the weeks leading up to a strike, but also or a lockout, but after them and more regularly to try and build on some momentum to better identify, understand, and develop solutions to the challenges we face. Thank you very much again to the participants. This webinar will be available on YouTube. Please share it to all. Thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.